Hello, welcome to this fifth talk in our ad hoc series on the relationship between Israel and India. I want to thank the Institute for Palestine Studies and Tariq Mahmood of the American University in Beirut for organizing this event. My name is Verinder Kalra and I'm your host for the event. We're holding this discussion as the continuing genocide against the Palestinian people continues unabated, and though there is much despondency in the academic community, we nonetheless can only continue to beat the drum against the horrific war machine that drives the state of Israel. In this regard, India is playing a major role in ideological support for the war. In my recent trip there, the silence of public support for the Palestinian people, which has meant that there are no demonstrations in the capital city or in states controlled by the ruling party, went to such an extent that a group of students were banned from showing the Five Broken Cameras documentary on their campus. This mundane example is reflected of the Hindutva state and its social media machinery, which is giving the impression that all of India is behind the Zionist entity. The Indian state is participating in this war not only through social media, but also through the presence of soldiers and the offer of labor to replace Palestinian labor in Israel itself. And as we will hear in today's talk, the arms trade between India and Israel is something that is a foundation, again, for the continuing occupation, not only of Palestine, but also in India, of Kashmir, and ongoing oppression in states like Manipur. We're really pleased to be hosting Azad Issa, an award-winning journalist who currently works for Middle East Eye and was previously at Al Jazeera and has also strung for many other media organizations. He's the author of Zuma's Bastard, which was republished as The Muslims Are Coming by HarperCollins India, and the e-single No Country for the Poor. And the book that he'll be discussing today, Hostile Homelands, the new alliance between India and Israel. Azad will speak to us for about 20 minutes. Please, as always, put questions and comments into the chat box or on the Facebook Live stream, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for a discussion. So having said that, I'd like to hand over to Azad.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching this discussion. I'd like to start off by thanking Dr. Kalra for hosting this event. And I'd like to thank the Institute for Palestine Studies, including especially Tariq and Laura for reaching out and organizing this event. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming to the webinar to engage on this issue, as well as on my work. These are extraordinarily tough times, and they've been made worse by the complicity and the support of Western governments in conjunction with these sort of puppet regimes or their puppet regimes around the world. The failure to stop this genocide too is also a manifestation of like weak and structurally flawed international institutions. And of course, many of us are fully aware of these issues. We know how hypocritical the so-called rules-based order is or has been historically and currently when it comes to the question of Palestinian self-determination, justice, and freedom. But what has been arguably lacking, for several years, has been the rise of other actors and new powers who have been sort of insidiously mapping their economic growth and their political influence at the expense of Palestinians too. So, in the context of declining US power, I think it's especially important to know who else is not just complicit, but also benefiting from the settler colonial and apartheid state and apartheid project in Palestine. And in this case, we are talking about India. Today, the India-Israel relationship has been built on ideological, militaristic, and political grounds and kinship, so much so that it has become a strategic alliance. So much so that last week, it was announced that Israel received Indian-made combat drones, which are likely to make their way to Gaza. Now, it is for this reason that I believe that this topic is urgent. And it is for this reason I am especially grateful to the IPS for giving me this chance to discuss this topic with you and to hear from you as well. Now, to get straight into it, in the popular imagination, the deepening of India-Israel ties and the India-Israel relationship as we see today is seen as the work of Narendra Modi. You may have seen images of Modi and Netanyahu walking on the beach, holding hands, whispering into each other's ears. And it's true, the relationship between Netanyahu and Modi is very close. And this relationship in India and Israel has accelerated under Modi. But the India-Israel relationship was actually facilitated by the Congress Party, the party that had been in power for most of India's post-1947 history. It was Nehru who first bought arms back in 1962. The story goes that India needed arms when it went to war with China. Ben-Gurion offered these weapons and ammunition, and the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, said he would take the weapons, but that Israel would need to send it in unmarked ships. Israel refused, and India became one of many countries with whom a secret military relationship would begin. Now, India would get arms again from Israel in 1965 and in 1971 in the wars against Pakistan. In fact, Israel was one of the first countries to recognize Bangladesh in 1971 because of their assistance to India. But here I would like to refer, to the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, in which the occupation, right, begins for some at least. And this is an important event. You see, though Israel had focused on self-sufficiency as a goal from its inception as a state, it was Israel's success during the 1967 war, in which the Arab states, as you know, were demolished within 6 days, that precipitated the expansion of its military-industrial complex. Until then, France had been the main supplier of weapons to Israel, and the US, following the 1967 war, becomes the biggest benefactor. And this is when the US begins to properly support the Israeli military. And it is from here that Israel's reputation as a bulwark of innovative weapons and defense technologies begins to take on a life of its own. Now, what has this got to do with India? Well, when 1967 takes place, India too, or at least the military and certain elements within government, they're also moved by the events of 1967. And there's an open sort of contestation over India's policy towards Palestine and Israel as a result of this war. And the military in particular looks at Israel with intrigue. Now, Israel's victory in 1967 effectively establishes the Jewish state as a key American watchdog state in the region. And Israel's reputation as a military and technical powerhouse continues to spread. By 1970, weapons sales made up an estimated 70 million, or nearly 10% of the country's gross exports, which is, incredible. And so what does Indira Gandhi do during this period? She sets up the Foreign Intelligence Agency, RAW, and she sets up ties between RAW and Mossad directly from her office. Now, it was Mossad who trained Indian army officials in the early 80s, including those who massacred Sikhs in the Golden Temple in Amritsar in 1984. Likewise, it was Rajiv Gandhi, her son, who fomented the first contact with an Israeli prime minister, and it happened in New York in 1985. Now, there are 2 points to mention here. The first being that both Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi saw the project of liberalization or joining the global economy as being linked with close ties with Israel and the US. At the same time that this is happening, the Cold War, during the 80s is drawing to a close, so to speak. And India is nervous about Russian arms, meaning that it needs to look for a new source of weapons. Meanwhile, Israel at that time begins reconfiguring its own, arms industry, including a move to the privatization of the Israeli weapons industry. Now, here is also a crucial point that the privatization of security in practice meant now, the management of conflict, not the end of conflict. And therefore, this meant naturally there would be an insatiable want for weaponry because wars don't end any longer. Wars need to be managed. So Israel, right, now 20 years or more into the occupation since 1967, is considered a long time and successful occupier in Palestine, is now seen as the gold standard in tried and tested weapons, as well as in techniques of control and surveillance, which leads to the second point. India, as it moves towards liberalizing its own economy, is also desiring to become a more powerful, militaristic, and influential state. And it looks on to Israel as a country to work with militarily. They saw Israel as a chance to leapfrog years of stagnation and a way to improve their domestic arms manufacturing industry as well. Now, India normalizes ties with Israel in 1992. And I mean, if you see from this slide, before we move on, it shows, this is from 1987, in terms of the deregulation measures that are taking place under the Congress Party. And if you look at the slide, or if you look at the image at the bottom, it talks about how the Western economists and leaders were buoyed by this move because it meant that Western companies would be benefiting. Now, Israel, as I say, India normalizes ties with Israel in 1992. And 2 years later, India's Air Marshal Chief S.K. Kaul and Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin meet under the radar. The Indian delegation tells the Israelis about its, quote, immediate and long-term specific requirements with the potential for mutual cooperation in defense modernization, joint research, and production, end quote. So India tells Israel from the early 90s what it needs. Now, Israel in response tells India that it's not only willing to sell weapons to India, but it's also willing to share its technology. And this in particular draws India closer to Israel because of this idea of it being shared technology. So it means that it could assist with producing its own domestic weapons industry in India, as opposed to just being dependent on weapons coming from outside. So in 1995, the Indian government agrees in principle to establish a defense attaché office in Tel Aviv. And India starts buying drones from Israel as early as 1995. The BJP party comes to power in 1998. And here is when things accelerate even further. In 2000, well, I guess there are 3 things to mention here in terms of this relationship that starts. Of course, the BJP is in power till 2004, but there are 3 things to mention during this period. The first thing is that in 2000, the Deputy Prime Minister, Advani, travels to Israel and becomes the first Indian minister to do so. On his return to New Delhi, Advani speaks of the modern nature of international terrorism and he sets up a joint working group on counterterrorism. He also discusses Israel's integrated border management system in reference to the systems in place along the Green Line that partitions Israel from the occupied, Palestine, occupied West Bank, for instance. And in the year 2000, India and Israel set up a joint terror commission. So this happens as early as 2000. Then the second thing that happens during that period, and which is extremely important, is that India conducts the nuclear tests in 1998 in the Rajasthani desert. And the US responds to these nuclear tests by imposing sanctions on New Delhi. And Israel becomes one of few countries who refuses to condemn India for the tests. So when the India-Pakistan War of 1999 starts, known as the Kargil War, Israel receives another opportunity to assist India and to demonstrate its kind of commitment to New Delhi. So what happened is that the Indian army, again, as they had battled in 1962 in the Himalayan mountains, they're battling against Pakistan in the Himalayan mountains, and they find themselves that they are ill-prepared, at this high altitude. And they ask for help again, and Israel comes to India's aid. Now, the quick response to India's request for military assistance increases Israel's sort of credibility as a reliable arms supplier, even during a crisis, or especially during a crisis, and even during a time when there's kind of a sanction or an arms embargo type thing on India based on the US, right? And so this kind of cements the relationship in a large way. Now, the third thing that takes place that kind of helps this ideological and militaristic relationship even build further, are the attacks of 2001, the 9/11. The attacks give rise or lead to the US-led war on terror, which spans decades and costs at least 900,000 lives, and from countries worldwide. Now, New Delhi came to equate the freedom movement in Muslim-majority Kashmir as one of terrorism, endorses and expresses support for this new civilizational war that's waged on the so-called Muslim world. So India joins the war on terror, which many people don't seem to recognize or acknowledge. India doesn't join the war in Iraq, for instance, or but it joins in principle the war on terror. So the attacks gave rise, and just as the US would pass the Patriot Act, India would pass the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is called POTA. And this provided the BJP government at the time an ability to expand its powers on matters of national security, including expanding surveillance, reducing judicial oversight, and even limiting public accountability in the name of fighting so-called terror. And this was called India's Patriot Act. Joe Biden, incidentally, was a senator back then, and he wrote to George W. Bush to have those sanctions lifted on India, as this sort of ideological project comes together, that they're also fighting against terrorism, so they also need India. In 2003, the Indian government hosted Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and I would like you to take note of the language here. In a joint statement, this is what they say: as ancient cultures and societies, India and Israel have left their mark on human civilization and history. As democratic countries since their inception, both nations share faith in the value of freedom and democracy. Both countries gained independence during the same period and embarked on a course of nation building to advance the well-being of their respective peoples and to build modern democratic states able to face difficult challenges. And so you can tell from this that the language that we are seeing today, if you see it on social media, if you're seeing it from the Israeli embassy in India or the Indian embassy in Israel, or the statements that are made either by Modi or Modi's government in terms of Jaishankar, or from the Israeli government itself. Much of this has its roots in the language that was put out as 21 years ago. And you can see an example of this in Netanyahu when Modi travels to Israel in 2018. It's the same language that's used. Our people have had thousands of years of history. India and Israel are two of the most ancient civilizations on earth, and it's amazing that you have visited Israel. No leader of India in 3,000 years of our own sovereign existence has visited Israel. So it's kind of this attempt to locate India and Israel as being these long lost friends that share kinship, that share several things, including being sort of modern miracles, right? So India is like the so-called largest, biggest democracy, and one day will be a Hindu nationalist state in which it'll be a developed nation, right? It will solve its minority issues and discipline them and put them in their place, and it'll rise to the heights of its past. The same story with Israel, the idea that they have reached, they came back to their land in which there was nothing and it was just a desert, and now they've created this amazing modern miracle of a state. The other element of this is that they both face common challenges, which they both face the Muslim threat, or as well as being outbred, the outbreeding threat as such, and that they have a civilizational project as well. Now we see the kind of weapons that, I'm just going to stop sharing this for a second. So what happens now during this period is that after 2003 till today, military ties absolutely explode. And so between 2000 and 2010, India buys an average of 1 billion weapons consisting between $1 and $2 billion per year. One writer at the time said that India was probably buying more weapons than Israel was purchasing from its own defense companies. And after 2008, India starts training Indian police. When Modi comes to power, something else changes. And this is the way India was willing to be seen amongst Israeli leaders. So Modi liked the idea that Israel was unashamedly a religious state without any hesitation, without any guilt. And second, that it was a strong military state. And so under Modi, arms sales increased by 175%. Now, what's the difference here is that during the 2000s, because the Congress Party returned in 2004, so between 2004 and 2014, these weapon sales increase and they continue to grow. But the Congress Party does not take any opportunity to spend any time publicly with the Israeli government or any Israeli leaders. And the difference when Modi comes to power is that it's now seen in their self-interest to project themselves as a kind of unapologetically militaristic and politically influential country who would assert its religious identity like Israel. So we are in a situation today in which India is Israel's largest arms buyer. It purchases around 46% of all Israeli weapons. India is not just buying weapons like drones, sensors, surface-to-air missiles, bombs. They are co-manufacturing these weapons in Indian factories across India. I'm going to go back to the slide. For instance, there was just a small technical issue with it. Right. So this is one of the more dangerous aspects of this relationship, in that India is not just buying these weapons from Israel. They are manufacturing all of these machine guns and semi-automatics. And in fact, this slide is a little bit outdated at this point because um, some of the drones on the left image is actually now being produced in India itself. And the question here is that what does it mean to have India co-producing Israeli weapons? Now, the first thing is that it means that India is trying to create its own domestic military arms, military industrial complex. Secondly, it is expanding um, Israel's market. So India will now be selling Israeli weapons to a larger market. And so you could see this as essentially not just subsidizing the occupation, because when you buy Israeli weapons, when you co-produce Israeli technology in India, you're subsidizing the occupation, but you're also mass producing Israeli weapons for a larger market, which means that when you sell Israeli weapons to other places, you're not just selling a weapon, you're not just selling a gun, you're selling a methodology, right? You're selling a way of governing people, a way of quelling dissent. And so this leads us to another question in that, where is this all taking us? Now, if you look at this image that came out actually in November last year, it shows you the outsized role that India is playing as a purchaser of weapons from Israel. And you can also see who are the other players in this, Azerbaijan, the Philippines, and we're looking at an extremely dangerous situation in which not only are these weapons going to be taken out of India and sold to African countries, for instance, or Latin American countries who are not on board, Palestinian project. They're also going to be sold they're also going to be used by the Indian Army itself in places like Kashmir and in mainland India itself. Now, just to give you an example of the direction that India has taken, this came out in 2019.
Because we already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. You have to look at if the Israeli people can do it, we can also. And you give some time, you will see what is going to happen. I believe the security conditions in Jammu and Kashmir will improve. It will allow refugees to go back. And in your lifetime, you will be able to go back. And you will be able to visit your villages. You will be able to go back to home. And you will find security. Because we already have a model in the world. Why we don't follow it. It has happened in the Middle East. You have to look at if the Israeli people can do it, we can also.
So as you can tell, like we are talking about, pretty much how the occupation is being internationalized in several ways. And this is an example from 2019 in which the senior diplomat said that they will be taking Israeli tactics to Kashmir. And so not only have some of these tactics now been taken to Indian occupied Kashmir, Israeli weapons like drones, sensors, these sort of smart fences, are now being used on the de facto border with Pakistan. And some of these machine guns and other sort of semi-automatics are also being used in Kashmir. But there's more than that taking place. There's these other collaborations between the Indian government and the Israeli government that are sort of sliding of falling under the radar. And Israel creates these things called centers of excellence. And these are kind of like these agricultural centers of excellence in which these units are set up in various parts of the country. They're also being set up in Kashmir now, in which they are supposed to be helping farmers in those areas, create more sustainable practices of farming, for instance. But what's so I'm just trying to take this beyond just the point of selling arms, right? It's about selling ideas and also about a different type of infiltration. So these centers for excellence, researchers have found that they are almost always linked to the Israeli military, and what this means is that there's the Israeli these experts, so-called experts, come in, and they will come to an area and sell the idea that Israel has made this modern miracle state and made the desert bloom, and these are the tactics that, or the strategies that we have used to make this place bloom. And so imagine going to a place like Kashmir where there's saffron and apples and walnuts and rice, and telling Kashmiris who have been farming these areas for like decades and centuries that this is the best way to do it. But actually, it's not just about acting as if like selling these fake ideas of sustainability, but you're actually actively going in to assist the Indian Army in taking away the best land, as well as trying to replace the indigenous culture and geography by shifting it and making it more applicable to the colonial state. So in Israel, they will be, they'll remove olive trees and the like, and they'll be putting pine trees to kind of Europeanize the environment. And in Kashmir, they're doing something very similar as well. And so this is the kind of direction that this military relationship is taking on the ground in that way. So much so that, in that first image I showed you,
we already have a model in the world.
In the first image I showed you with the drones, so much so that Israel is now, built up such a close relationship with India that these drones are now being sent to Israel. Combat drones are being sent to Israel that might be used in Gaza. And there's a story that I'm working on actually currently, and it's supposed to come out today, but hopefully tomorrow, in that you may have seen that last week these farmers in India went on started a protest calling for like minimum prices for their produce, and they were met with immense violence from the Haryana state police. And so what we found is that the Haryana state police, as well as the leadership of the state, went to Israel in 2018 during the Great March of Return protests. In fact, during the heart of it, the deadliest months of those protests in Gaza, and they essentially went to learn from the Israeli government and the police how to deal with protests and how to deal with what they call in India sort of agitations. And it was in the Great March of Return protest that Israel first used drones to shoot or to fire tear gas on protesters. And last week, the Indian police in the state of Haryana were the first police department to use drones to also shoot tear gas on the farmers, right? So what we are seeing is that not just a move in which tactics are taken from Israel and moving to Kashmir, but then they move slowly to the mainland of India when needed. And what we're also seeing as part of this military relationship that's now moved into the economic sphere as well as the cultural sphere, you see things like the messaging that's being pushed out by Israel through like stories of series like Fauda that's now being produced in India under different titles, or in this case, a production company in India made a show called Tanav. and that was essentially set in Kashmir, and it was the Indian version of Fauda. So all the stories that took place in the West Bank in Gaza, they moved it to Kashmir, and all the heroes and all the villains were, either Kashmiri or India, based on the Fauda story. So kind of this production, this militaristic, this ideological sort of kinship that's formulating, which has been given a boost, and I'll end on this point, has been given a boost by the US and the UAE in the creation of this West Asia bloc, which sees the US's war with China, resulting in it being, it drawing closer to India and trying to move the supply chains from China to India, and creating this new corridor between that would go from India to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia, and then to the Haifa port, and then and from the Haifa port move to the west. And today we have the Haifa port being owned by an Indian company, which is the same company that is sending these drones, essentially. That is in a joint partnership with Albert Systems. And so you have this entire ecosystem that's being built, in which the Indians are investing in Israel militarily. The Israelis are investing in India by taking their technology and sharing it with India and using Indian labor. You have the UAE becoming the first investors in Kashmir. And so and then you have the US sort of like being the body that kind of looks over, and provides so-called security. So that's where we're at, and I'd like to end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Azad, for a really concise but very insightful talk. We'll allow the audience some time. I don't know if they're just gathering their thoughts to start putting some questions in the chat box, the Q&A box, and we'll see if there are any questions coming from any questions coming from the Facebook Live. I want to ask you a question. Like, in terms of the ways in which the arms industry works, how much of this roots back to the big US companies? Like, how much of this is like Lockheed Martin's tentacles? I just kind of, it's the big brother in the room. I mean, Israel from '67 became a junior partner to American imperialism. India, since 2014, has been really desperate to kind of take on I mean, Biden is the only person, or not Biden, but the US are the only people that the Indians listen to. And if we think of the case with the killing of the Canadian Sikh at Niger, where the Canadians basically said to Modi, you kill this guy, he ignored them, massive campaign against Canada. The case again in the US, where they go to court and show that the Indians have been targeting these Sikh activists, they're very quiet and very acquiescent. So I'm kind of just, while we're waiting for questions, but many are coming, so we can do this quite quickly. I just kind of, what is the relationship to the American arms industry and the big 3 or 4 in the American arms industry?
Thank you for the question. So, in the early 70s, as you know, Russia or the Soviet Union essentially signed a deal with India, and this sort of fomented this long-standing relationship with the Soviet Union and India when it came to weapons. And this was partly the reason the US had some skepticism, or major skepticism, regarding India, and this has lasted the longest time. So from my understanding of this, and I stand to be corrected, The U.S. arms industry were not involved in India as much as they began to get involved, or let me rephrase that. They were not involved initially as much because the US was not interested in, or not sure about the relationship with India and where it would go. But these things have now changed. That in the last 15 years or so, you had Lockheed Martin actually open up an office in India. I think it was about 2006 or 2007. Recently, it wasn't long ago, a few days ago, actually, Lockheed Martin said something to the effect of they would be building a kind of repair center in India. So the point here is that, from my understanding, the Indian government was told that to get close both to the global capitalist economy, or to be close to the US economically, as well as to US arms manufacturers, you would have to be close to Israel first. You would have to normalize and move through that route. And given the history between the US and India, especially like in the late 90s, in which there was this embargo because of the nuclear tests, it does make sense to me that the US companies were a little bit slow to get on board. So from my understanding, this was not facilitated by Lockheed Martin and the US companies, but they are definitely coming on board now. As you see more innocuous things as Apple, right? So-called innocuous thing, Apple moving to India. So you're also seeing a larger kind of move towards India, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, let's move. I just took my privilege as chair there. Let's move to the questions. So the first question by an anonymous attendee is, was India ever anti-Zionist?
Okay, so this is you'll have to ask them and see if they give you a straight answer. And also it depends who you ask, because look, there are many phases to this relationship and many dimensions to it. You could say that someone like Gandhi and Nehru, they understood something about Palestine, understood something about Israel, or the Jewish state coming to being from a colonial prism, from a colonial lens. They understood that, because the Indian National Congress was an internationalist organization. That's how they saw themselves. But they also had their limits, and in many ways, obviously, right? And so in the beginning, there's this element of seeing it as a colonial project, and so they veer towards being pro-Palestine, or at least anti-colonial in that way. But the Second World War takes place, the Holocaust takes place. People start shifting as a result of the horrors of the Second World War. And even Gandhi, seems to have changed his mind in a way, right? There are some reports that, some of the stuff that he has said has been kind of buried, because India then becomes sort of one of these first huge nations to gain independence. And it becomes like a beacon of the global South, or at that time, the so-called Third World. And it does not suit its interests to have this ambiguity regarding, colonialism, right? And so what I need to emphasize here is that there are these elements that showcase India as being, anti-Zionist, right? But that's a policy that becomes the state policy, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's a state policy that's based on moral values, but it's based on self-interest at the time, for self-preservation. So India becomes a state, and it needs to decide on who its friends ought to be and who its enemies ought to be, at least publicly, because it needs certain things to be, certain boxes to check. What are one of these boxes? Oil, energy. It needs energy from the Arab world. So if it moves against Israel, if it moves against the Palestinians towards Israel, maybe it moves its relationship, important relationship with the Arab world. Likewise, it has this problem called Pakistan, right? And India doesn't want the Arab world to move closer to Pakistan as well, especially being Pakistan being a Muslim country. So that's, naturally that would be, in their imagination, that would be the inclination. And thirdly, there's this thing in Kashmir that's taking place in which the Arab world knows what's going on. And so India wants to keep that under wraps. Excuse me. India wants to keep that under wraps and doesn't want the world or the Arab world to move towards that. So there are these decisions that they are making to present themselves as pro-Palestinian. And there are actions that they take. Sorry, let me just take a sip.
Sure.
And there are actions that they are taking. But these are filled with contradictions, one of which is the non-aligned movement. In our imagination, India is seen as one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement. And as a result of Israel not being invited to the non-aligned movement meetings and not being part of the alliance, it is understood that it is India that didn't want them there. But in actual fact, it was other countries who didn't want India there. And Nehru was actually open to Israel coming to early meetings. But it suits the narrative that this was a sort of like an Indian foreign policy based on these anti-colonial strands, right? But not the fact that it was actually not very exceptional to any other country. That's one. Now, the second part, I'm sorry for the long answer. The second part is that you had India signing on in 1975 to Resolution 3379 that said Zionism was racism. So it marked itself present in terms of the resolution, saying that India was not on board with Zionism. But 20 years later, when the Israelis say that one of the first things that has to go ahead of negotiations at the Madrid conference, for instance, was that Zionism being racism has to be struck off the UN. And so India then strikes it off. It votes for Zionism not to be racism anymore, right? And so one Indian writer, I forget his name, really amazing writer from the early 90s, he wrote, is like, India needs to tell us, is Zionism racism or not? Or did they change their mind? Or is Zionism not racism anymore? How is it that because Israel has said that they won't go to negotiations on the basis of this resolution, now suddenly you don't think it's racism anymore? So that's why I go back to the point, you got to ask them what do they think? Because it does feel that in the 70s, it was easy to say that Zionism was racism because that's where the direction was moving. In the 90s, it was this international consensus that negotiations won't take place unless we get rid of that determination. Sorry for the long answer, but that was
No, I mean, I think it's appropriate, and I do want to just add an addendum that obviously India wasn't one thing after and in the 1950s and 60s. There are communist states. The states are very powerful, and some of those states are anti-Zionist. West Bengal, Kerala are still supporting the struggle in Gaza. But the centralized Indian state, I think your analysis is completely correct. But there's always been these, and this kind of segues into the second question, actually. So in a way, where this is Sam Mohor from Palestine, are there any grassroots efforts and or legislative actors in India pushing back against all this? And you can plug your book here. Also, is all this info listed anywhere online that we can reference? So.
Well, I definitely don't have all the answers on this. This is becoming a full-time beat, and it's frightening in terms of how fast things are moving and how new information is coming out. So yes, there are many efforts to try and push back. There are small efforts, there are big efforts, there are efforts that are falling under the radar, there are efforts that are being quashed immediately. It depends where you are in India. India is huge, right? For instance, if you're in Kashmir, you can't even talk about Palestine in the mosque, right? It's straight, right? So that tells you the level of repression in Kashmir. In Kashmir in the past, and I think your viewers and listeners would be interested in this, is that in the past, you would have graffiti on the wall saying like go India home, right? Azadi for Kashmir, or whatever those slogans would be on the walls, graffiti. And the Indian army would rub those out, but it would leave up free Gaza. There'd be free Gaza on the walls. And so there was this interesting element in which people would write free Gaza, but they're actually talking about themselves, or free Palestine, they're actually talking about themselves. So they can't talk about Kashmir, but they talk about Palestine. And so it means both Palestine as well as Kashmir. But in the last 10 years, they've been striking out the free Palestine, the free Gaza stuff. That's no longer possible there as well. So that tells you the nature of the state, the insecurity of the state, right? So that's one. Then if you are in Maharashtra or in Delhi, in Haryana, those places you can't be imagining to go out and do protests for Palestine. You'll be arrested immediately, and you'll be, I think in Delhi, some student protesters embarked on a little vigil, and they were taken in police cars and left outside the city. This is the kind of brutality. But if you're in Kerala, for instance, there are tens of thousands of people who have come out and they have protested and spoken out, right? But again, it's about who is in charge of the states and the ability of the states to absorb this kind of anger. That's one. The unions are speaking out finally, and they're trying to do so. But I would argue there are 2 or 3 things here that are important. The first thing is that India is a country that's, it has billions of people, and the unions are actively being, targeted to being quashed and squashed, right? And the unions don't represent everyone. Most people are unorganized in India, right, and not in the formal sector. So the unions can only reach that many people, right? As many people that are members. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a lot of disinformation about the relationship between India and Israel, meaning that as India starts moving towards liberalization, the media, the corporate media, starts promoting that relationship. So a lot of people didn't know that, when it was announced in November that the Israelis want Indians to come to work in Israel in the construction sector to replace Palestinian workers, many unionists didn't know that this deal had been set up prior, months in advance, because this type of stuff is not being reported properly in India. So that's the second element. So there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of manufacturing of consent for India's relationship with Israel that's being pushed onto the masses. The third thing is that in terms of what is taking place, you had the unions come out and say that they don't want workers to go to Israel. They have said that. They've pushed for that. They've also said this is a genocide, and they call for a ceasefire, and they want the occupation to end. And you also had unions who organize in 11 of the major ports in India, come out and say that they don't want to handle any cargo, arms or weapons cargo headed for Israel. They're not going to touch those ships. But again, that's not the full story, or it's an attempt on their part. But there are so many other ports that are run privately by Adani and co, who have the direct relationship with Israel. And so, there's these things that are happening, and they're very important and they're very inspirational, but they're happening in pockets because of the type of suppression that's taking place. I do think that more actions are going to take place in India, and more organizations from the left are going to come out even further, because now it's become, it's already out of control. It's already ridiculous. But I think the story about the drones going to Israel, the story of Israel needing more ammunition, and maybe Indian labor is going to produce some of those ammunitions. I think people are getting really riled up, and I think you'll see more action soon.
Thanks, Azad. There's another question from Tariq Mahmood. Thank you for an excellent enlightening lecture. While the occupation in both Palestine and Kashmir have learned from each other, what could the resistance learn from the current developments? What could the Kashmiri resistance learn, or what would be the given that the states learn from each other, how can the resistance learn?
Yeah, this is both a very easy question and a very hard question, because I spend so much of my time trying to understand how they're operating that I sometimes forget to think about the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. And one of the things we have to understand, one of the things we have to remember is that both the Indian state and the Israeli state are copying colonial practices in many ways. This is not something original. So if we look at Israel, they borrow from the fascist movements from Europe, they borrow from the colonial British entities, how Britain treated Ireland, how Britain went onto the African continent and colonized parts of the, or many parts of the African continent. No wonder Cecil John Rhodes was reached out to by Theodore Herzl saying, well, I need your help, right? Because, it's something colonial and I need your assistance. So that's the key part here. This is not a new thing. None of these things are new. Only the technologies are new. Level of brutality, the level of attempts to kind of divide and rule, the attempts of subjugating a population, using psyops, using methods of censorship. These are all old things. So we have to watch, or we have to learn from the movements of the past, how they dealt with these colonial entities and how they created these solidarities. And the answers are there, essentially. Now, that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is that India, for all purposes, they are very unoriginal in many things. Indians are very unoriginal when it comes to all of this. You think about how Hindu nationalists are copying Zionists in the US. Anti-Defamation League exists. Hindu nationalists create the Hindu Anti-Defamation League. Okay, if the Zionists create a kind of organization that goes after curriculums and says you can't call this occupation, and there's no such thing as apartheid, you have the Hindu nationalists going in and saying, you see this map that you call South Asia, this is actually called India, right? This is Akhand Bharat, right? And so it's the same tactics. So I don't have the answer for you to say that here's what you have to do, but I think the methodology lends itself for us finding those answers.
Okay, I'm getting unconscious of time. So there's a couple of questions around the NDA, the defeat of the BJP in the coming elections and the return of Congress. So whether you think that's going to make any difference, or whether you think both parties are just loyal to the relationship with Israel. So I think that those are two questions we can take together, I think, basically.
So I would leave the actual answer about whether the BJP will come to power to Indian political analysts, to be fair and to be honest. My impression is that there's no way that they will lose this election. That's my impression. Given what they have done with the Ram Temple, for instance, and they created this vibrant attempt to showcase that we're reaching the heights that we promised you, right? And that sort of ideological and populist sort of discourse is extremely important in India, and it's functioning and working very well for the BJP, despite the fact that the economy is not doing as they are promised, right? They're not performing as is promised. I mean, and the proof of that is if you notice that so many tens of thousands of people want to go to Israel to work. Why would people want to go to Israel to work if they are getting the salary, they're getting the jobs? There's a huge unemployment crisis in India, and this is not just amongst those who are in the working class, as in people working in labor, daily labor tasks. We're talking about graduates who can't find jobs. And so there's a huge economic rot in India. And so I don't think that has reached, a level of discourse that people feel that, oh, you know what, we need to change this government because it's just selling us all of this hate and all of this other dreams and stories and myths, and it's actually not doing anything for us materially, just creating billionaires. So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon because they own the discourse at this point. In terms of Congress coming to power, which they won't, but just say they do, the relationship with Israel will not change. It will only be taken a step down in terms of its rhetoric in these terms. And I think the proof is there. They are the ones that set up the scaffolding, set up the entire structure, the architecture for this relationship to boom at this point. We got to look at it as Democrats and Republicans in that way. I don't think we should look at it in any other way.
Yeah. So again, I think the next question is about effective resistance in India, which I think you've already covered. And then the similarities between Zionism and Hindutva. Well, I'm going to plug the series. If you listen to the first lecture in this series by Amrit Wilson, you'll get a real nice examination of Zionism and Hindutva. There's a question about the narrative about the Arab Muslim world in terms of Israel and India having similar strategic culture. And I was wondering actually if you did want to go into that in a little bit more detail, because when you were talking about the corridor with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, hasn't the recent events kind of broken the possibility of the Abrahamic Accords of this? I mean, hasn't what happened on October 7th kind of put a halt to this strategy around the relationship, the economic relationship? I mean, how do you kind of see that? Because I know you talked about this a little bit, but I think it would be interesting in terms of contemporary events to talk a little bit more about that.
Do you mean the economic relationship between India and Israel?
Yeah, because if it's going to go through, you were saying it would go through the UAE and Saudi, and really, is that now a possibility given what's going on in Gaza?
Yeah, this is a big question, and this is again a very complicated question, probably too big for my brain. But I would guess, or I would answer this question in this way. The first thing is that this corridor that they have suggested is a pipe dream already. It's already a thing it's very difficult to create. To get the Jordanians on board without their population revolting against, a railway track going through Jordan, going into Israel, is already a massive idea, right? A massive thing, a massive pipe dream. So it's a difficult thing from the start. This has put a spoke in the wheels of this plan. However, we already hearing a few things that are coming out. First thing is that the Abraham Accords have not come up in any way with regards to them being broken, right? In terms of what has happened, that has not come up. Not that I have seen. It has only delayed the possible normalization with Saudi Arabia. That's how it's been framed, as far as I understand, which tells you that many of the states still want to continue working with Israel, and this call for a ceasefire is nothing more than a begrudging call for a ceasefire. They begrudgingly kind of like, oh, we need to have a ceasefire because the populations are getting aggravated, and so they have to work hard to maintain and balance how the populations feel, because obviously the Arab street is not happy with what's going on in Gaza. I mean, who is, right? That's one. Now, on the Indian side, what's fascinating to me, and I don't think it has been explored enough, and I wish someone did, and maybe at some point, I can look into it also. But a lot of this relationship with Israel is predicated on India's relationship with the Arab world. So when the Abraham Accords took place, it opened the door for India to go, quote unquote, wild with Israel. It opened the door for them to understand that there will be no repercussions, no issues from the Arab world if they become really close to Israel. So in Hostile Homelands, the book, which I wish I had a copy somewhere, but in the book, I discuss in detail, it's actually painstaking detail about how Modi goes to all of the different countries before he visits Israel. It is so interesting. He goes to Saudi, he goes to Qatar, he goes to UAE, he goes to Egypt, he goes to all these places, and they don't tell you exactly what's spoken, but they have a great deal, that a great partnership that comes out of those meetings, and it's very clear. After a few months, he says, "Now I'm going to Israel." So he goes and ensures that he gets the support to do that, right? And he goes and checks out what's the vibe essentially in those places. Now, what's the point here? The point here is that India is watching what the Arab world is doing, to what extent they are going to push for a ceasefire, because ceasefire is basic, right? It's not even anything serious, right? It's just like the bare minimum at this point. They're watching how the Arab world is pushing towards this. And they're also watching carefully to see if the Arab world changes tone with Israel. Now, should they change their tone with Israel, India would have to take a step back with its relationship with Israel, because India gets a lot of money from the Arab world in terms of remittances. And so you may have noticed a couple of years ago, one of the BJP leaders said something really rude or really arrogant or messed up about the Prophet Muhammad. And it was the only time that there was a pushback and the BJP had to apologize, or there was some kind of repercussion for that person because the Arab world said something. Now, usually, whatever happens in Kashmir, whatever happens to Indian Muslims or any other minorities, the Arab world doesn't say anything. But should the UAE or Saudi say something, and India feels that, oh my God, this might result in us losing that $1 billion worth of remittances that we get per year, or our Indian workers will be kicked out and sent back to India. So there is a thing there. It's actually, my last point about this is that the pulse of India's relationship with Israel shouldn't be seen as how the US treats Israel. It's how the Arab world treats Israel. Because the India is not interested or bothered by the US any further, because India knows that the US needs them in this war with China. But it's actually the Arab world that holds the key here.
Yeah, very nice analysis. Okay, so I think we have a few minutes, and we have two big-ish questions. The first one, I think you partly answered, because it's about why is there so much further in terms of people fighting for Israel in Gaza, given that Israeli society is so racist. So these 100,000 Indians who will go to Israel are not going to be treated very well, as all of the other poor migrant sods get treated who suddenly think they're going to Israel. So I think you partly answered this question, but you can take it if you want to. And then the last question, which I think actually is quite, again, it's quite an interesting question, is around the idea of, is there any possibility of India being taken to the ICJ in relationship to arms trade, because Japanese or Belgian companies have ended their ties because of the prevention measures. So anyway, these are two quite different questions, but I'm going to leave it to you, because Laura may come and sort of stop us talking, but I'll let you see how you can handle those.
If I understand your first question, is that why would the Indians want to go?
Yeah. Why so many citizens so kind of wanting to go to Israel? Why would they be willing to go? And I think you answered it in terms of the unemployment, etc. But I suppose it's just the willingness to fight as well, in terms of
So before before October 7th, there were around 18,000 Indian citizens in Israel. They are working there as tech workers, caregivers, construction sector, maybe a little bit, but not too much, I suppose, at that point. They're also they're also students. So, again, there are several ways of looking at this. The first thing is narrative. First thing is really the narrative. Over the past 10 years, there's been this attempt to showcase Israel as this beacon of democracy, beacon of modernization, beacon of liberalism. Netanyahu went to India and he met the Bollywood elite, and the picture went viral, and people were mocking it and all of that. But it's a big deal, because what he did is that he met this Bollywood actors, and he then set up a small fund in his own office, in his prime minister's office, to encourage sort of Bollywood production in Israel. Now, when you do that, you are basically trying to encourage people to see Israel in a different light. And you're also trying to encourage cultural production between India and Israel. So one of your viewers asked, what's the issue, or what's the possibilities of resistance, and creating new forms of resistance. Well, one of the things is cultural production. Israel has learned from India, it seems at least, the value of soft power. So when you think of India, you're thinking about, what are you thinking about? Yoga, thinking about non-violence, thinking about Gandhi. You're thinking about Shah Rukh Khan, right? Even if he's playing a raw agent, right? He's still Shah Rukh Khan, right? You're thinking about cuisine, right? You're thinking about music. You're thinking about Sadhguru, right? Trevor Noah has Sadhguru on his show, right? Hindu nationalist stuff, but he cares for the environment. So this kind of ideas of India, which Perry Anderson also talks about in his book, the Indian ideology, this set of ideas and things that we associate with India. Israel wants to tap into that association. And when Israel then is seen in other places, which ordinarily would not be amenable to Israel, or will not be so friendly to Israel, but if they're linked with India, then it's kind of you're giving Israel a new chance of rebranding itself. So what I mean by this is that India has pushed Indian media has pushed a new idea of Israel to its masses. So there are people who are going to Israel to work because of work. They need work. They don't know. Maybe they're not caught in the lure of this of this Israeli modernity. But there are others who are also looking at Israel as a place of as an escape. They're looking at Israel as the US, in a way, looking at Israel as Europe, right? So they want to get to a better place. And so I don't think we should discount the cultural effect that's been being imposed onto people. So that's why people are going. I don't know if this matters, but several sources that Muslims are being told that they can't apply to go to Israel, right? Which creates another kind of dimension to all of this. But that's my short answer. Long answer.
I mean, thanks very much. I think we should take the last one because Laura's not kicking us off, so that's great. And this one is about the ICJ. I mean, it's quite a long.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to ask if you can talk about it's asking about the fence with Gaza Strip that inspired the India's smart walls in the Yellow Sea that you mentioned in chapter 2 of your book. And also,
sorry, say that again.
Charged for so the first part of the question is talking more about the fence that inspired India's smart walls, which they're saying that you mentioned in chapter 2 of your book.
Yeah. What about it?
It's just saying, could you talk more about the fence? That it's just something you mentioned. But I mean, like I said, it's not a specific. It's just a general question. But I do think that the question about the ICJ ruling and the impact on defense companies is quite interesting, really.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things happening, behind the scenes in several countries with regards to trying to hold India accountable. Funny enough, South Africa, which is where I'm from, South Africa is one of these hubs of trying to hold Israel accountable as well as India. So there's actually a docket at the National Prosecutor's Office right now in South Africa regarding Modi. And what has happened is that the National Prosecutor's Office basically is being told that Modi needs to be sort of arrested for the crimes of Gujarat, as well as things that have happened since then in other parts of India, including Indian occupied Kashmir. And the prosecutors are not taking it forward based on the fact that they haven't been given witnesses, and witnesses are not coming forward because they're afraid. And so there's this real mix of things taking place. So there are, short answer, there is a possibility of these things happening with the ICJ. But there would have to be clear proof that these drones have made it into Gaza, that these other things that are taking place. There are a lot of rumors happening, like, for instance, that Indians are fighting in Gaza, right? Now, there's no need to make up things at this point, right? So, of course, there might be Indians fighting in Gaza, yes. But these are Indians who moved to Israel, became Israeli citizens, right? And that's different, okay? Because everyone is from somewhere else. It's from Israel, right? In terms of all these military and stuff, the South Africans there and all of that. So it's not like Indians have been imported into Israel just to fight this war as such. So we have to be very specific and very clear cut about what we are saying, or at least we don't have evidence of that yet. So yes, that possibility exists. But yeah, that's about it I can say.
Okay, I think I am going to have to stop there. Azad, thank you so much for a really illuminating talk. Everybody on the call, his book is available from Pluto Books, and I think you put a discount code in the chat box, the webinar chat, Hostile Homelands, whereas you'll get a lot more detail than this. But yeah, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending also.
Thank you so much for hosting this, Dr. Kara, and to IPS as well. I really appreciate this taking place, and yeah, I look forward to more discussions. I do have a newsletter. You can find it. It's azadisa.substack. It's free, and it kind of tries to track all of these relations between
could you put that in the chat for? Could you put that in the chat for people who are here?
Yeah, I just put it
That's great.
to Laura.
Yeah. Okay.
And
the recording will be on the IPS Facebook page.
Yeah. No, thank you very much.